Welcome, everyone, to today's Away Home webinar on Youth Homelessness Community Plan 101. My name is Oksana Rudenko, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. For today's webinar, I'm helping out with the tech side of things. So if you have any technical issues getting connected to the webinar, do send me a direct message, and I can help you get that sorted out. For the webinar today, you will need your headset or you will need to turn on your computer speakers to a comfortable volume. Now, during the question and answer period at the end, you can use the chat box to post your questions or comments, and throughout the webinar as well, you can use the chat box to send us a message. We are also recording today's webinar, so if you're unable to stay or want to share the presentation with others, a link to that will be emailed out to you. And I'd like to now pass it over to Mary Jane McKitterick, who is the Community Planning Manager with Away Home Canada. Go ahead, Mary Jane.
Thanks, Oksana. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first in a series of monthly webinars from Away Home Canada, designed to increase knowledge and capacity on youth homelessness community planning. My name is Mary Jane McKitterick, and I'm the Community Planning Manager. Our key presenter today is Dr. Alina Turner from Turner Strategies. I would also like to take this time to thank the Government of Ontario for their generous support of this webinar series and their commitment to increasing the capacity of communities to prevent, reduce, and end youth homelessness. I'd like to acknowledge that this series is in partnership with OMSSA, the Ontario Municipal Social Services Association, and the COH, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and thanking Oksana very much from the COH today for all her support in setting up and the running of these webinars. About us, Away Home Canada is a national coalition dedicated to preventing, reducing, and ending youth homelessness. And while I will be brief on our coalition today, as I want to leave as much time for our main presentation, I do encourage you to read more about us at our website, awayhome.ca. Just briefly, our key national partners. Away Home Canada is a national coalition, we're composed of national partners, and they are, I'll just go through them, Raising the Roof, the Push for Change, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, EGAL Canada, the Alberta Government, and the National Learning Community on Youth Homelessness. We work with our funders as partners right at the table with us. We want to acknowledge and thank the Catherine Donnelly Foundation for their support, partnership, and vision, without which we would not be here today, and to the Home Depot Canada Foundation for their national support on the issue of youth homelessness. They have been tremendous supporters of Away Home. So just briefly, Away Home works in sort of 8 key areas, or we like to call them constellations of activity, of which community planning is one. They are partnership and collaboration, youth voice, research, programs, government relations, public engagement, and a community of practice, as well as community planning. In fact, we began our work back in 2012 with the community planning to end youth homelessness, and the other areas of work grew as a response to the needs of those communities engaged right in the planning. So critical to understanding how we work is knowing how the various constellations or areas support one another. So although our webinar today focuses on community planning, you will see that effective planning requires excellent research, outreach to government, engaging youth voice, and program models that actually deliver results. But I'm sure you'll see those elements as we work through our program today and throughout the year. Away Home began with 6 pilot communities gutsy enough to begin this journey with us, who taught us a great deal, and I'll just briefly mention them here. Kamloops, BC, Kingston, Ontario, Wellington County, Ontario, St. John, New Brunswick, Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and Brandon, Manitoba. Now we are committed to supporting all communities with tools and resources, and here is a growing list of support. We provide them free of cost to communities that want to engage in planning to end youth homelessness. But that's just a tiny sampling, and many, many more, and details can be found on our website and throughout the Homeless Hub. But I do encourage you to explore our resources and tools at awayhome.ca. We also hold Catalyst events, present at conferences, and for 2017, this webinar series is a significant effort to bring experience and knowledge to as many communities as possible. We also have a bi-monthly Youth Homelessness Community Planning newsletter, and I will be sending out a new one this week. You will all be added as recipients as part of your participation today, but if you do not want to receive this newsletter, please just unsubscribe. If you don't receive the subscription, please email me. My email will appear at the end of this webinar. So just briefly on our webinar series, it's a year-long and it's divided into 2 phases. This webinar is the first in phase 1, followed by 2 more, one on collective impact and the other is a primer on the role of Ontario service managers. Phase 1 lays the groundwork for future webinars and creates a common understanding from which we can all build. Phase 2 is being developed. That slide should say April to December, not June. So we'll have one a month from April to December. Maybe not over the summer, maybe just one. So we're looking at topics around funders, government policy, research, youth engagement, regional planning, achieving early wins, and much more. We'll be conducting a few polls today, though, to obtain some more information from you. And there's opportunity to add your suggestions for webinar topics to the chat box. So please feel free to do this throughout the webinar. We'll be taking questions at the end, but if you want to just add your questions throughout, that would be a great idea as well. We'll also use this information to determine the topics covered in phase 2 and in their order of importance. So please add those as well to the chat box. Webinars are being recorded and will be available on our respective websites. So, webinar 1. I think it's the Youth Homelessness Community Planning 101. Before Dr. Turner begins her presentation, let's take some time for our polls, though. We'd like to run a couple of those. Oksana, could you set those up? Thank you. Please answer, who are you? And just as many as you like. And we'll give you a few minutes to do that. We have time for one more poll. Who are you in your community planning process? Please pick one. Or sorry, where are you in your planning process? Please pick one. Thank you. So this is great. So I can see from this poll that most of you are at the not yet engaged or in the early stages. So that's really valuable information for us. Oksana, thanks so much for that. So before we set the foundation, I'd love to introduce you to our key speaker for today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Alina Turner, whom I'm sure many of you know or know personally. Dr. Turner is a leading homelessness researcher and is a fellow at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary. She supports a variety of organizations to support human service, system planning, and integration, including plans to end homelessness and transitions to housing first. She also engages in academic and applied research on issues including housing stress, poverty, domestic violence, migration, and rural social issues. She has extensive experience in strategy and program development on a variety of social issues, and she works very closely with The Way Home as a content expert. So welcome, Alina.
Thanks. Thanks very much, everyone. And actually, I think those polls are a really good idea because oftentimes we're doing these webinars and we don't know who's on the other side of our phone lines. So this really helps us tailor how we're going to present today's content for you, and especially given that most of you are in the early stages or just considering taking on this work. So thanks for that, and please feel free to drop questions in your guys' little screen there on comments, because again, if there's things I can incorporate as I go through the content, let's do it as we go through the topics as opposed to waiting for some things right at the end. So I'm more than happy to answer things as I can throughout. So we wanted to give you the basic scope of what it takes to build a youth homelessness plan, and really it's divided into 4 stages, even though we recognize sometimes you're moving between all of these at the same time. So by no means are these necessarily steps. They're just kind of chunks of content to try to make sense of what it takes to build a plan and to take it from the beginning through to a launch and implementation. So we're going to go through what it takes to get ready to set the foundation for your work. So an introduction to youth homelessness and youth plans. And I know lots of you are content experts on youth homelessness, but how does that actually fit into building a youth plan? What is actually the content of a youth plan, and what are those essential plan elements we need to keep in mind? And there's some things that are in all plans, and then there's some things that you can tailor to your unique context, but try to make a differentiation between that. The getting started piece is around collective impact and youth homelessness planning as part of a collective impact effort. So setting a broader context around the work. So it's not just a plan for plan's sake, it's part of a bigger change process. Community readiness, especially for those of you just starting to think about it or in the really early planning stages, this might help you think through what key challenges you might have, and alternatively what you're really strong on to build a solid foundation for the work moving forward. The backbone supports, and those of you that are familiar with collective impact will recognize that the backbone supports are essentially the coordinating functions of an organization or group of stakeholders that sort of man the process throughout. So what does that look like in building a plan to end youth homelessness? Getting going is about the research needs assessment and data analysis that needs to be done to actually build the content for the plan. Consultation and engagement approach that is a given, and obviously how we engage youth and government in the work are going to be something we touch on, and we'll actually have a special webinar just on that, but we'll give you the basics today. Working with the key stakeholders, like I mentioned, government and youth, but there's obviously media, and how do you manage the needs of diverse agencies that may not have a stake in youth homelessness, or how do you navigate when you have a homelessness plan in the community, but you're now introducing a population-specific component into the mix. So those are the stakeholders that often come into play when we do this work. And then getting it done, I find this is where communities have the most trouble, and that's the actual sitting down and writing the content of the plan. So a lot of folks do a really, really good job on consultation and research, but then synthesizing and breaking all that information down into an actionable plan is an art in and of itself. So we'll talk about what that process looks like. Calculating implementation costs, that's again something that folks have trouble with, actually putting a dollar value on what it's going to take to end youth homelessness, and there's a lot of discomfort with doing that, but at the same time there's also some benefits in taking a stab at this piece. The performance measures and setting targets, again, that's in terms of implementation really critical, and often youth plans will include some targets or indicators of progress as well. So we'll talk about that, as well as some implementation considerations that you will likely struggle with, just like your colleagues in other communities that have gone before you. So we'll attempt to learn from the experience of others throughout. Okay, so moving on with the getting ready component. So setting the plan's foundation. I'm presuming based on the poll and the registration that lots of you are Ontario service managers or have a service provider role. So you're likely experienced with working in this field, so I don't need to give you a 101 on youth homelessness. I think for the purposes of building a plan, you have to be really clear from the outset what that target population looks like. So, are you talking about youth at risk? Are you talking about vulnerable youth? Are you talking about youth experiencing multiple barriers? What is that what is the scope of the plan? And obviously that's going to impact the type of stakeholders that you can bring to the table. In the Away Homes work, there's a move to align our definition on youth homelessness with that of the National Observatory, so the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness definition of youth homelessness. And that definition, if you're not familiar with it or where to find it, we can actually throw it up into our resource page, or and I'm not sure, maybe Oksana can grab that and throw it up there into your web links, because that's really setting the foundation to say this is a national movement and we're going to align communities' work with a national definition on youth homelessness. And it's a very inclusive definition that doesn't exclude a particular subgroup of youth. So obviously this idea of prioritizing long-term homelessness is catching a lot of efforts across the country, but this definition is inclusive of those that are at risk or transitionally homeless or chronically homeless. So it's broad enough to likely encompass what you're thinking about locally as well. So we really encourage you to take a look at that. The other piece that's important in building a case for a plan, if you haven't already, is to paint a picture of what's different about youth homelessness. And again, we have resources and bullet points that you can take and essentially cut and paste and adapt to your local context. But to summarize, it's not, as Steve Gates always says, it's not the 2.0 plan version that you can just cut and paste a plan for the broader homeless population in the community and just slap a youth sticker on it and call it a youth plan, right? So the causes of youth homelessness are distinct. The interventions have to be tailored very differently, and obviously even the implementation approach and costs associated are going to be different. So the plan is going to have a very different grounding, research-based, and ultimately approach moving forward. So it's important for stakeholders to understand the value of doing this separate strategy on youth homelessness. And again, if you are not familiar with those arguments around what is distinct about youth homelessness and the causes of youth homelessness, etc., in our toolkit, we can again point you to the web links. The toolkit that we developed for Away Home will actually have a section that you can take and adapt locally based on Steve and other researchers' work in this area. So then that brings us down to this question of whether you actually need a separate youth plan. And the reason we wanted to put this on the table is because a lot of communities already have broader homelessness strategies or homelessness plans. Especially in Ontario, you're obviously required to have these plans in place. And so it begs the question, well, doesn't that just cover off our youth component? And the answer would be yes and no. So my question would be whether you have a strategy within that broader plan that addresses the unique needs of youth, and whether it's a possibility, if you don't have that instead of having a separate document that's not related to your bigger community plan, could it be a subset that feeds into it? And so obviously the context and the stakeholders are going to be a little bit different that you need to navigate, because it would have to link into this broader umbrella plan. And as you do this work, there might be implications for that broader plan. So you might have not allocated enough resources for the youth component that you're now really getting into researching. And so it might have implications in terms of updating your bigger community plan, for instance. So with some examples of that, if we look at communities in such as Calgary, there's a separate youth plan, but it links into the bigger community plan as well. So that there's two separate documents and unique strategies, et cetera, but there's links throughout the reports and references to the other strategy. So that's one way of navigating it. On the other hand, Edmonton, again, I'm going to Alberta because I've just been working on the youth plans out there. But in Alberta, there's a separate strategy for the Edmonton work around youth homelessness, and there's a broader Edmonton plan to end homelessness generally. So there's ways of navigating this without necessarily having an adversarial approach to, do we need to choose chronic or homelessness or youth homelessness? It's not what this is about. You can have more than one priority in the community, and it's really about using this planning process to bring attention to this particular subgroup and really aligning your interventions to make the most impact. So the other piece that I've seen in communities like in Newfoundland is to actually have a call for provincial strategies around youth homelessness. So rather than St. John's having its separate youth plan, what they did is put out a position paper saying this is a provincial issue, public systems are involved beyond the St. John's community, so we really need the province to come forward with a strategy or a plan to end youth homelessness province-wide. So that's another approach if the community is perhaps not quite there in terms of developing a plan. That doesn't mean that the planning process can't happen at a different level. The other piece to point out here too is just because you're taking on the planning process, which can take sometimes a very long time, that doesn't mean that you should stop actions. So developing pilot programs or pilot interventions and doing your advocacy work with different levels of government, that doesn't preclude you from taking those actions while you're building your plan. In fact, when you marry these ideas, they're likely going to create much more buzz around the issue and get much more community buy-in for the work if you actually have some actionable steps that you're already taking alongside the planning process. So just some ideas to keep in mind. The last piece that I'll note on this foundation slide is that we're promoting a prevention approach to youth homelessness, and not just because we see now through research that today's homeless adults there's overrepresentation of those that were homeless during their younger years, so we actually have a better understanding of that trajectory, but also because prevention tends to have a better outcome for all partners involved. So if you think about a prevention lens to youth homelessness and think about it from a primary, secondary, tertiary lens, then you can see how you're going to have some interventions at those various levels. So public policy, affordable housing policy in your community versus those shelter diversion programs and housing first rapid rehousing programs at the kind of secondary, tertiary levels as well. But it's also about building the case that we need public systems involved. So that idea of discharging from child welfare into housing instability for youth is not going to solve the problem. So we need to have a way of linking into these other public systems as part of our planning process. So that prevention lens helps you think through what those pathways into homelessness are for youth and then the intervention points as well. And again, if this is unfamiliar content and you want to have a better sense of the research behind this and rationale, I'd say the toolkit will paint a more comprehensive picture of the evidence base for you and can also point you to the actual research behind all of these statements as well. And the idea being that, we've got a lot of resources going into this work at a national level, so there's no need for communities to replicate literature reviews that are already done out there that you can just tap into and adapt the content to your community's needs. All right, so this idea of a youth plan as collective impact, the key point here for those that are familiar to some extent with collective impact is that sometimes in the actual work we confuse creating a youth plan with achieving collective impact. So just because you actually have a youth plan doesn't mean you've actually ended homelessness. And I know that seems very obvious, but as you get into the mess of this work, the messiness of it, you'll likely experience some aspect of this. so that you see the launch as being the be-all, end-all, and then oftentimes the energy fades off as implementation nears, and sometimes nothing happens or very little action happens once your plan is in place, and you look back 5 years later and think, okay, what did this plan actually achieve? And we don't want that to happen. We want you to think as engaged as possible with that implementation goal in mind, because if the plan process doesn't get you to the ultimate impact, which is ending youth homelessness, which is a collective impact approach, then you're not going to set up the foundation with that in mind. So again, for those that are not familiar with the collective impact model, it's this idea of having a coordinated approach across agencies, across funders, etc., where we move towards a common agenda. We have shared measurements so that we can track progress. We have mutually reinforcing activities and continuous communication between the key stakeholders, and then all of that is supported by a backbone organization or organizations, often called backbone supports, because we don't want to just point to one entity as being that supportive organization for this work. So just the key point here is the plan can contribute, but it will not in and of itself bring about that desired social change. We've got to do a lot more work in implementation to see that through. I mentioned the plan priority areas and talked a little bit about prevention and system integration and housing and supports. Here, these are the key elements that we see in all the plans that we've examined that are, again, doing a good job in addressing youth homelessness. So prevention, I talked about that in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So that includes systems, public policy changes, things like agency coordination so that we can better identify a risk and intervene early so that we keep families united where possible and support family reunification for youth. But we also have rapid rehousing responses so that youth that do enter the homeless serving system can return to a stable housing environment and be supported long-term without having that turnover where they come in and out of homelessness throughout their younger years and into adulthood. So that prevention approach is an ongoing theme in these plans, and that's because, again, it's supported by the evidence base, and it's something that we would encourage you to consider in building your plan. System planning and integration, this notion of building a coordinated system of care that addresses youth homelessness across programs and agencies as well as funders, so that you have a coordinated entry model in place, a consistent way of assessing and referring youth, and then this idea of integration between systems that, and with respect to youth homelessness, that it would obviously involve your child welfare right away on, and that's, of course, besides your homeless serving system itself, it would likely impact your rent subsidies and housing allowance programs, so that those might be managed by the province, territory, or municipal government. So again, that needs to be brought into play. And then you'd have your justice, so police and corrections and youth corrections as well, that would likely have a role to play in this work. Housing and supports, the case management and the housing types that are involved in addressing youth homelessness, both from prevention and intervention perspective, the design of emergency shelters and transitional housing programs, obviously accommodating diverse needs of youth, and that would include Indigenous and LGBTQ. The leadership and engagement as well as the resources. That's that's in a way a given that you'd need to have leadership from all parties involved in government levels, all the way from administration to the political level. And then within agencies, the frontline management and executive directors would have to have buy-in, and that's across agencies. So the other thing to keep in mind, especially when we think about housing and supports, is as well as system planning, oftentimes we look at the youth sectors in our communities as distinct from the broader sector, and what we're actually seeing as we have better access to HIFIS or HMIS information on shelter use, etc., is that the youth that we're talking about, which is the 16 to 24-year-old age groups, they are often found in the adult systems. So they're using emergency shelter, transitional housing, intensive case management programs that are not necessarily the Boys and Girls Clubs or counseling programs that are specifically targeting youth. So it's important when you think about your plan and scope your target population as well as your stakeholders from that you actually understand where youth are accessing supports currently. Because if you're only looking at youth-specific services, you're likely going to miss a very large chunk of the population you're trying to help. Okay, so the next slide is around community readiness. This is just a snapshot of a community readiness assessment that we've included in the youth planning toolkit, and we just wanted to point you to it because it's a great resource if you are at the beginning stages, which some or most of you are at, and it goes through the key elements involved in building a plan and taking on youth homelessness efforts at a community level, and actually helps you see where your current gaps are. So it goes through elements like your backbone support organization, and for instance, is the backbone actively supporting aligned activities by convening partners, providing technical assistance, and recruiting new partners. And then your choices are significant investment is needed, there's a strong current situation, or some investment is needed. And it just helps you go through to see where the gaps are currently. And it goes through the development of a plan, but then also the implementation of the actual plan. And so some of you that are nearing or already implementing your youth plans, and especially if you're concerned about the progress you're making, this might be a useful tool for you to see where the gaps are against collective impact priorities. Okay, so the getting started, I know it's like all this work just to get ready, but the getting started it's really centralized on this idea of the backbone supports and the planning team. And usually there's an organization that takes leadership on coordinating the planning process. And oftentimes that's a funder, but other times it's actually a stakeholder committee, so it has a representation from diverse sectors. And sometimes it's literally one person that's a champion that's taking this on their own, especially in smaller communities where you might not have the luxury of having a dedicated full-time position to this work. But either way, there's a planning team at the center of this work. And that planning team includes a number of roles. The first one is the project manager, so the actual staff or person that's overseeing the process and bringing all the players together, creating the agendas and setting the meetings and hiring researchers and all of that work. It's done by this project manager role. Again, that might be a person that's seconded to the project, or the project is assigned to them in their current role, or is specifically hired to do this on a contract basis, depending on the scope and timelines of your work. Then you have this steering committee, and that's primarily where you feed the various stakeholder groups representatives to one table, where they provide the project manager and other folks working on the plan with advice on strategic issues. So they might review the documents you have at certain stages. They might point you to research reports. They might open doors for you to get access to key stakeholders and decision makers. The backbone supports are the organizational infrastructure needs of the planning committee. So is it one organization that's going to provide you with meeting space and administrative support? Who's going to actually manage the contracts for your design folks to create the plan communication materials, etc. So just that idea of who's going to be doing this work is what this slide is all about. And then you've got that last box of experts and consultants. And I've been all these boxes at some point. And as a consultant expert, content expert, I'd say you have to be really, really strategic about when and how you engage consultants in the work, because the idea is to build capacity at the community level to do the implementation work. So if you put most of the content expertise development to an external person, then do so with the idea of co-learning as part of that contract or some of the deliverables, because as that person moves on to another community or another project, that knowledge leaves with them as well. So that's not necessarily a problem if you're strategic about how you incorporate that external expert into your planning team, because you can have a process that involves the project manager and the steering committees throughout. So when the expert leaves, they leave a lot of content knowledge behind as well, and tools, etc. So there's some steps and some pointers in terms of negotiating these agreements with contractors that you might be considering that are also in the toolkit as well. We also include terms of reference for the planning team and steering committee, description of job expectations for or job descriptions for the project manager, and some pointers in terms of contract clauses for the consultants you might hire. Okay. So a lot of folks often ask us, well, what's it actually going to cost me to do a youth plan? And unfortunately, the answer is it depends. It depends on your timelines, how much staff you can put to this work from your existing resources, what data has been already done in the communities, and what data and research needs are outstanding, because again, that's going to have an impact on your resource needs. Political context, so if you have a climate where research is not supported or planning is not supported, that might impact how much of your funding is actually available for this. And obviously your consultation needs, if you want to have a very comprehensive approach that's going to include hundreds and hundreds of interviews and focus groups, obviously there's going to need to be a budgeting towards that. So what we've done here is show you the items, the sample budget items that are often found in planning proposals or planning budgets, and then give you a high end and a moderate and a minimal, so the Cadillac versus the, I don't know what a cheap car is, but the opposite of a Cadillac. The staff time, consultation fees, meeting expenses, youth incentives to participate in consultation, printing, parking, travel, report layout and design, that's another one. Plan launch events, or if you're going to have facility rental or catering costs for a big community event versus if you're going to have a small informal report back to community. So that all is those are all variables that the planning team will have to make decisions on based on what they have available to them. And the big thing that I would say is your biggest cost is going to be the staff time. And where you can allocate staff time, great, but truly that's still an in-kind contribution, so that does still have a cost to it, because that staff can't be doing another job because they're assigned to this work. In terms of staff time that you should budget for to allocate to this type of project, again, that depends on whether you have this very fulsome consultation process, or whether it's a matter of pulling together existing documents and into a report. So you'll have to figure out, scope out exactly what the work entails to see if you need a 0.25 and the full FTE or 0.1 of an FTE. So, and I've seen it done every which way as well. I've also seen the staff role divided among different agencies so that it's not one agency carrying that staffing burden. It's actually shared. I would say that in those cases, your project manager, so the person who is actually coordinating all these different staff people in different agencies, is even more critical, because that's even more moving parts that need to be brought together in the final product. So just some considerations as opposed to a set cost. Okay, so laying the foundation. These are these again seem basic, that you should have a clear vision, mission, and guiding principles to your work. But I can't tell you how many times we've read reports where these are not stated up front and haven't been discussed as part of the consultation process. So we really wanted to put this on the table early on and say your planning group should be thinking about, what it means to them to actually have ended homelessness and what the guiding principles would be for them to actually take that work on. Because, again, these are things that are going to permeate through the consultation process. These are things you should be checking in as part of your engagement to see if these vision statements and these principles actually make sense to your stakeholders, as opposed to at the end when you're building your document, you say, oh, oops, I didn't actually have a vision statement, or I don't have any principles for this, so I'm just going to make them up right now. Well, that's, you have an opportunity to actually consult community on building these together so that there's a likelier sense of buy-in at the end when they see themselves in this work. So I would just say consider the guiding principles that we outline in the toolkit again, and those are this idea of integrating housing first into the work, a human rights lens, so housing is a human right for youth and every other group for that matter, having this prevention focus on system planning and integration, collaboration, and having it as youth-centered, which means integrating youth voice from the start, and even the planning group, you should consider how you can integrate the youth voice within those activities as well. So that could include hiring a youth to play a key part in the engagement process, providing an honorarium for them to sit at the planning group or steering committee table with you and giving guidance on this process throughout. So this youth-centered piece should be a principle that's applied in planning and implementation as well. Okay, so getting going. Okay, so this idea of grounding the plan in evidence is basically a fancy way of saying you need to do some homework before you even go to community with a consultation approach. There's a lot of information that already exists on best practices and successful approaches to addressing youth homelessness at a program and community level. So getting that information, getting familiar with it so that you're not replicating work that's already been done for your benefit is, I would say that's a major time sucker for people. And you often go down the rabbit hole of too much research and not enough action. So I would say give yourself some timeline and around this research and scope it out really well and leverage the syntheses that are already out there so you're not replicating the work that's been already done. And then figure out what's missing, what don't you know. So if you haven't done a point-in-time count or if you haven't done any youth-specific research in your region, then yes, there might be a need to figure out a way to get a sense of the scope of the issue in your particular community and then build out a research plan from that as part of your community plan process. And again, this is something that might impact your consultation approach, because if you do have some needs in terms of doing a survey with youth where you understand the dynamics in homelessness and you've got some a sense of numbers from your shelter account, but you don't have a sense from your rough sleeper population, how many are youth, then again you can build that into your consultation approach as well. Policy analysis refers to the need to link your efforts to what else is happening at the provincial level. So if there's opportunities for you to hook into new legislation or practice frameworks in the various systems that are involved in youth homelessness, like child welfare or justice, etc., and obviously homelessness and housing are the obvious ones. But understanding that policy situation and how that aligns or doesn't align with your work in this area, then it becomes really important. Environmental scanning, so understanding the who's who in your community and what work is being done around youth homelessness and more broadly around homelessness and affordable housing will be key as well. System mapping, this is a I'm not sure if it's its own term now, but it's essentially the idea of understanding which programs are serving your target population and what interventions are used, what eligibility criteria and prioritization criteria are being used to screen youth in or screen youth out, and then their outcomes and impact they've had. So they often look like schematics of program types. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, we'll put up some resources, maybe Oksana, on system planning to give folks an idea. We summarize it in the toolkit, but if you're interested in system mapping more specifically as part of system planning in general, we can point to some resources. What you're looking for in this exercise is housing market information, demographics, core housing needs, and particularly extreme core housing needs, shelter utilization, service use, etc., but all through the youth lens, right? So the reason you want to do this work is because it paints a picture of need in the community, and then later on when you try to figure out what interventions you need for what population, this information becomes critical, because this is where you build the business case for saying there's a gap in emergency shelters for LGBTQ youth, for instance, or we have shelter utilization in our adult system that is increasingly taken up by younger adults under the age of 24. So this is where that trend analysis is really important, because it builds the case for your proposed interventions in the plan. Okay, so your consultation approach and how you want to build that out. It comes down to best practices in consultation and understanding with your planning group which stakeholders you want to engage and why, right? So are we just informing? Are we gathering information? Are we trying to involve, engage, or partner with the different stakeholder groups? So being clear about that early on and not making promises you're not going to deliver on obviously will be key. Your timelines will impact this as well. If you have a very tight timeline and you're really informing as opposed to partnering, then think about the ramifications of that in implementation. And if you're not going to meaningfully engage partners, then that's obviously going to impact your implementation success later on. So you really want to be smart about how you structure the consultation work in community and with government especially, because again, that's going to play a key role in your success later on in implementation. So again, we've got tons of resources on this that you can tap into, and especially around subpopulations. Here's a sense of what's available to you. So especially around engaging youth and engaging diverse youth, especially Indigenous youth and Indigenous people in general, and working with them in the planning process. The toolkit that we have will actually take you through some examples from Edmonton, for instance, where youth were part of the research process. They gave a guided tour of their daily experience of homelessness to key stakeholders. Others created some photo journals and did that as part of the research process. So there's a way that you can, again, integrate that youth voice throughout planning and implementation from the beginning. And then there's specific ways that toolkits that have been developed, especially from away home loops, and there's an Indigenous toolkit as well that we can point you to if you want to know more information about it. For better or worse, there's a lot of information on how to best engage youth, so it's a matter of making it work for your community and your goals. But I would say that their best resource will be youth, and if you bring them to the planning group table, then they can provide you with feedback before you make any decisions. Okay. So the next and the last part of the setting the foundation work is getting the actual plan done. So the key plan components, if you haven't seen one of these plans, I recommend you just take a look at Away Home's website, because they've actually collated all the different youth plans that that are out there in Canada and beyond. So you can see there's certain things that they all include. And when I was talking to some of these stakeholders, they said, well, oftentimes we just look at the table of contents of other plans and then we build ours from there. And that's definitely an approach you can try. So we've included some analysis on these tables of contents and what the key sections actually entail. And generally you've got priorities, you've got strategies, and then you've got goals. So there's these big picture, ideas of, we're going to tackle prevention, we're going to reform the homeless serving system for youth, and then building from there, you've got strategies, so and goals, so actionable goals that you can take to implementation. You've also got targets. So an example would be by 2020, we will have decreased the number of youth entering emergency shelters by 50%. So that would be an example of that. And performance indicators are another piece that's often included. So performance indicators would often align to things that you will find in the functional zero definition of ending homelessness. So length of stay in shelters is one that often appears as an indicator. Another one would be the point-in-time count, so comparing time over time, decreases in use that are in the point-in-time count, sheltered or unsheltered definitions, and making some inferences about whether you've been successful in your intervention. The other one is the level of perceived quality of services that you have, so that often includes working with youth as part of your performance management or quality assurance process, so that you have a consistent measure to say, yes, our housing firsts are perceived as making a positive impact for youth. And then your actual interventions often have measures and targets associated. So especially for those of you that are service managers, it's a matter of looking at your agreements and figuring out which of these targets are applicable to addressing youth homelessness and where you might need to tweak the indicators to make sure they align with your goals around ending youth homelessness. So an example would be your Housing First programs, and their targets, expected targets, might look differently in terms of length of stay or destinations that exit for youth versus adults, because your adult housing interventions might consider non-market housing or market housing as kind of the most typical positive destination. But then if you have youth that are reunified with their families, it might at times look like it might not be a positive destination because they're now in hidden homelessness again. So it's a matter of figuring out how these measures play out vis-a-vis youth homelessness. And again, if you understand the interventions really well and you've done your consultation work, then you'll hear feedback from the community of agencies implementing this type of work, as well as youth on issues with current measures and how you might address them. So that again should be part of the questions you have as part of your consultation approach. The prevalence of homelessness and youth homelessness in your community, when you make the case for a youth plan, you often, again, draw on that initial research and say, in terms of core housing need and extreme core housing need, here's what it looks like for our region overall, and here's what the 14 to 24 population looks like in terms of younger adults and youth. So it's a matter of taking that analysis and to the next level to talk about a particular subgroup. The estimate of the at-risk population, especially of youth, is a really tough thing to do. Oftentimes you need to rely on service provider reports. So how many youth are they seeing that are vulnerable to homelessness, and what's the profile of needs for these youth, and as well as demographics, etc. And then it's also a matter of connecting with your public system partners in child welfare and justice and health to talk about what they're seeing in terms of vulnerability for this population as well. So based on that, you create a profile of your at-risk youth population. And then the kind of mirror of that is the population that's actually experiencing homelessness. And again, we often talk about flow through the homeless serving system in emergency shelter, transitional housing, and sleeping rough. So it's a matter of breaking that down for youth as well. And the reason for it is that if you have a sense of the numbers in each of these categories, so how many youth that are experiencing homelessness have a high level of needs or high acuity versus lower acuity, that helps you estimate the gap between your current system, which you understand because you've done your system mapping that we talked about earlier, and then you understand the delta to get to a system flow where you've effectively ended homelessness because the time in shelter and sleeping rough is now under, a certain number of days. So that's the whole point about creating targets and performance measures, is because it helps you work backwards to figure out what your service needs are, and from that you can then get into modeling solutions and developing a funding ask, right? Because then you understand that in the community you might not even have housing first for youth. They're currently served by adult intensive case management programs, and you know that there's an insufficient access and access barriers for youth, especially younger youth, and you need to invest in that area. And then if you understand how many youth would need that service from your at-risk and your currently homeless analysis, then you can figure out what the program space needs are, as well as housing space or rent subsidy units that you need to create, and then you can calculate the costs of that. Of course, the idea being that somebody's going to listen on the back end of those funding asks and actually give you the resources to implement the plan. But if you don't even develop this funding ask, then the plan becomes this, visionary document, but it doesn't give you an implementation pathway. So it's something that I really encourage you to think about, and you might not include it in the plan, but having that system capacity and funding analysis done, at least, and have it in your back pocket so that it can help you build an advocacy effort around the plan. I think it's a really critical part of this work. And like I said, it might not be something there's appetite for today, but if you understand that solving youth homelessness in your community is a $2 million ask as opposed to a $200 million ask, well, you're going to have a very different conversation with decision makers at the various policy tables and funding tables. You're going to be advocating the plan too. So that's really the whole point of that. If you've never done this type of work before, of modeling or developing this type of analysis, again, we have to point you to the toolkit, because we have some work in there to show you how to do that, how to take you through this entire process of going from estimating the population numbers in need and then taking that through to modeling, if we're going to end youth homelessness in 4 years versus 2 years, here's what that looks like, right? And here's what the cost would be, how many units of housing we need, how many program spaces by each program type, right? Because you might have supportive housing units that you need to actually build, so that's going to impact your timelines considerably versus relying on rent supplements, which have a much quicker implementation effect, but are also going to need operating dollars really quickly. So all those things need to be thought through. Again, whether you write that out in your plan or not, that's part of the planning group's work. Because again, this is where things really fall apart in implementation, is people don't do this homework, and then they have a plan, and that's about it. So we really encourage you to think through the nitty-gritty of this, and then the next step would be who's going to actually man this process moving forward, because the planning group's mandate is to take you to this launching of the plan, but who's actually going to do the implementation work of the plan? So of course the idea is that we have a community-wide approach, but it comes back to that collective impact work, that somebody still needs to be that backbone organization for this plan. So where's the plan going to live, and who's going to provide the leadership and the resources needed to coordinate the community around these priorities? In this chart, if you've considered whether something is something you can deal with in the planning phase or we'll just deal with it in implementation, here's some guidance on that. So the target population and projected intervention needs versus modeling of the solutions, etc. You can see in the planning column that we recommend or think these are essential, but if you're not going to do it in the planning, they certainly will be essential in implementation. There's a risk register for you to consider as well, and risk registers are just things that are likely or have a likelihood of happening that will impact your success in implementing the plan. So political changes, funding decisions that are looming, etc., obviously will impact you. Unfortunately, competition from other issues are something you actually need to sadly think about, because we're still in a climate of scarcity around social priorities, and so oftentimes youth homelessness will be pitted against other issues like poverty or chronic homelessness, which is very unfortunate, but it's a reality and it's a risk to your initiative that you need to think through. So there's other risks like your inability to come up with the funding to actually implement the plan. So let's say you've come up with an ask that if you had $10 million, you would be able to solve homelessness in X community. Well, if you only get $5 million, then what's the risk to your reputation as an organization or as a stakeholder group in this work? What if the policy changes you've recommended to various systems are not adopted? Again, what does that do for your ability to deliver on the plan as a community or as a backbone organization if you've taken on that role? So the risk register that we've included for you to look at in the toolkit will take you through some of these common risks and some mitigation suggestions. And again, it's not to say don't do this work, it's just going in with eyes wide open and having these conversations very early on so that you're not going to community and launching a plan and then you're being held accountable to something that's not necessarily in your control. So if you're clear about that in the plan and in your communication, then again, you've got a better ability to share accountability for the implementation with a broader group of key stakeholders, and you're also able to protect the integrity of the plan and its credibility in community because you were honest about the key pieces that needed to come together for it to be successful. So it's not that the plan is not successful or the assumptions behind the plan are not accurate, it's that in implementation, you're relying on other key players to do certain things, and if those things don't happen, then obviously it's going to impact communities' ability to meet this goal of ending youth homelessness. So that risk register and that type of thinking in terms of system planning is, again, something really essential for implementation consideration as you move forward. And who's going to actually do all that is something, again, that I see communities struggle with. So where does the plan live? Will it live with your community entity or your service manager in the case of Ontario, or will it be a stewardship group that's made up of diverse stakeholders, similar to your steering committee, that provides like overall governance, and then you have an organization that's assigned as the backbone support? Again, that's going to cost you in terms of resources because that's going to require staffing, office space, etc. So if you're, again, clear about those needs early on and have the conversations about implementation, you're going to have a much greater chance that this plan will actually take a foothold in your community that is sustainable as well. All right, so next. Okay, another plug for the Community Planning Toolkit. So again, it's just to say that this webinar will give you a flavor of what it entails to address youth homelessness in your community, and we have so many resources that you can leverage in your work, and really encourage you to take a look at the Community Planning Toolkit and other resources that Away Home has, and this webinar series will really help you get a much better grounding of what it entails. And there's areas that we might have not thought of, so please let us know if there's certain things you want to know more about from today, or from seeing what the agenda looks like for the rest of the year, because we're all ears at this point. We haven't done this before, so very committed to hearing from you and to meet your needs. Okay, so hand it over to Mary Jane.
Great. Thank you so much, Alina. That was wonderful. And each time we've had opportunity to discuss this, I always learn something new from you. So I really appreciate your work on this so much. So thank you.
Thank you.
Love to have a poll now. So this poll is a little bit longer, so we'll give you a few more minutes. Choose the 3 topics that would be most useful to your planning process in 2017. So there's a few here, and I'll just give you a couple minutes to finish that off. Oh, and if you prefer to or have a selection that is not included in this grouping or something more specific, please just add it to the chat box and we'll include it in our tally. Thank you.
And if you don't see a topic that you want to know more about, that's also something we'd love to hear from you on.
Exactly. Great. It's always good to have Plan A and Plan B.
So there's a question from Alice about contacting someone after the webinar with further questions. Mary Jane, did you want to?
Yes, the contact, Alina and my contact information will be at the end, but ideally you should contact me, and my email will be there. So please forward any questions you have. We could also respond to this chat box and send everyone the email for questions, but when we get into questions next, once the poll's finished, we will be able to send everyone an email link to our responses as well. Yes, it is recorded. All our webinars are recorded, and they'll be located. Oksana, will they be located on your website or ours or both?
I'll send a link, and then we can share that through the Eventbrite emails. Yep.
And then I'd like to put the link on our own on the Away Home website as well.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I guess our poll's done. Thanks so much, folks. We just have time for questions now. So, are there any other questions or any questions that you would like to but please spread them in the chat box. It's 2:15 Eastern Standard Time. Yes, Eastern Standard Time. So we have about 10-15 more minutes for questions. The next webinar that we're going to be hosting in this series will be on February 28th. We'll send out an Eventbrite invitation to all of you. I will post it on all of the usual spaces and places, so that'll be there. We'll have Dr. Stephen Gates and Melanie Redmond discussing collective impact. So that'll be really, I think, a really exciting webinar. So we're looking forward to having you all come back and invite your friends and colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'd like to thank our supporters, especially the Ontario government, OMSSA, for bringing out a lot of you folks are from OMSSA, and I really appreciate seeing your names there, and very excited that you're joining us. Of course, the COH, thanks so much for everything you do. Thinking that's the end. Oh, and we need our contact information. That's the questions. So my name's Mary Jane McKitterick. My email is there. I'm at awayhome.ca. Currently, my phone number is in flux because we're moving offices, but if you contact me, I will get back to you, and we will have a phone number up there shortly as well. Please also note, and I did not mention this earlier, but the other thing that the other space that we're creating is the online forum on the Homeless Hub, the workspace. Please join the workspace. There is a youth homelessness section and a community planning channel within that. And by registering for the workspace, we can begin to have these, or continue to have these conversations online in an open forum and support each other. Dr. Turner's phone number and email contact information is there as well. Again, I really encourage you to visit our website. We did go through a bit of a revamp on the Away Home website, and all our resources are there. So all those really great tools and information that you'll need as you work through this. And of course, the toolkit, because the community planning toolkit is our big star. Thank you, Alina, for that one too. Is there anything else then that Oksana or Alina would like to add to this? Or?
No, we really hope this was of use, and again, good or bad, we want to hear what you liked, what you didn't like about it, so that we can make this better, and we look forward to you guys attending the next one too.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you so much. Okay, I guess we're done. Have a wonderful afternoon.